It began as one of those summer days that felt too normal to ever expect tragedy. The kind of day when airports hum like predictable machines, when families say quick goodbyes, and when a Boeing 747, one of the most trusted aircraft ever built, seems like a fortress of certainty. But on July 17, 1996, at New York's John F. Kennedy Airport, fate was already quietly tightening every link in a chain that would break only 12 minutes after takeoff. Inside JFK, security was unusually tense. America was still living in the shadow of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, and the man accused of masterminding a plot to destroy multiple U.S. airliners, Ramzi Youssef, was on trial in Manhattan that very day. Agents were on edge, scanning crowds with a different kind of suspicion than usual. Every passenger, every bag, every glance felt like a potential threat. Yet for the thousands moving through the terminals, this was just another evening flight schedule. Among the travelers were Becky Olson, 20, and her best friend Michelle Becker, 19, two college students from Macon, Georgia. They had saved for months, planned for months, and dreamed for even longer. Paris, a wedding, a backpacking trip through Europe. It was supposed to be their first great adventure. Their parents, watching their daughters step into adulthood, felt that bittersweet mix of pride and worry familiar to anyone who has ever raised a child. For Michelle's father, the trip carried a touch of love and sacrifice. He had saved enough airline miles to upgrade the girls to first class. In the mid-1990s, a first-class seat on a transatlantic 747 was nothing less than an experience. Wide seats, real meals, and the sense of something special. For the girls, it was a thrill that made the long-awaited trip feel even grander. Elsewhere in the country, 29-year-old Jamie Hurd was rushing through the final errands at his family's auto shop in Maryland. He had modernized the business, digitized everything, and become indispensable to his father. Now he was finally taking time for himself, flying to Paris to reunite with his girlfriend studying abroad. It was his first trip to Europe. He packed quickly, said goodbye, and headed for New York, unaware that every detail of his ordinary day would later be preserved in memory by the people he left behind. At 4:31 p.m., the Boeing 747 that would operate TWA Flight 800 arrived from Athens. The aircraft was 25 years old, well-maintained, and had completed over 16,000 flights. It would be refueled for its evening journey to Paris. More than 100,000 liters of Jet A would be pumped into the wing tanks, but the large center wing tank would remain nearly empty, standard procedure on warm summer routes. Passengers began boarding around 6 p.m. There was laughter, impatience, and the usual end-of-day fatigue. Michelle called home from Terminal 5 with a dilemma. TWA is offering cash to anyone willing to take a later flight. Should we take the deal? It would help our trip budget. But the upgraded first-class seats were tempting. Her mother advised her to stay with the original booking. It was a tiny, benign decision, one of those moments people revisit for the rest of their lives. Inside the cockpit, Captain Steven Snyder, an experienced 747 pilot with thousands of flight hours, prepared with his crew for departure. Everything was routine until a small but significant issue emerged. A checked bag belonged to a passenger who was nowhere to be found. Since the 1988 bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 over Lockerbie, aviation rules had become strict. No checked luggage could fly without its owner on board. For TWA 800, this meant delay. Outside on the tarmac, the summer heat intensified. The 747's fuselage absorbed it like a metal greenhouse, and the air conditioning packs beneath the cabin worked overtime to keep the passengers cool. While the cabin remained comfortable, the belly of the aircraft, especially the area surrounding the central fuel tank, slowly grew hotter by the minute. 50 long minutes passed until the missing passenger was finally located. She had been on the aircraft the entire time. At 7:59 p.m., nearly an hour behind schedule, the doors were closed and the crew received clearance to begin pushback. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the engines ignited with a deep, familiar thunder. Families watched from the terminal windows. Pilots taxied toward the runway. For the passengers settling into their seats, fastening belts, adjusting blankets, and preparing to watch the lights of New York fade beneath them, it was an ordinary ritual. Ordinary, except for the weight of history quietly shifting into place. At 8:19 p.m., TWA Flight 800 lifted off, climbing through layers of humid evening air bound for Paris. No turbulence, no technical warnings, nothing unusual at all. Flight attendants began preparing the cabin. Passengers relaxed, unaware that the aircraft was flying through some of the busiest airspace in the United States, airspace that bordered active U.S. Navy training zones just off the Atlantic coast. In another aircraft nearby, an East Wind Airlines pilot watched TWA 800's steady ascent through the clear sky. Visibility was excellent. The 747 looked steady, powerful, unremarkable. Inside the cabin, the first 20 minutes of any long-haul flight are always the same. Passengers adjusting to the climb, the settling-in period of a journey that would have lasted 7 hours. For many on board, excitement was just beginning. For others, fatigue set in. For everyone, the world still felt safe. No one knew that the chain of events leading to one of the most extensively investigated aviation disasters in history had already been set in motion. They couldn't feel the heat building beneath them, couldn't hear the aging electrical wiring humming through the belly of the aircraft, couldn't know that within the massive center wing tank, vapors were slowly reaching a temperature they were never meant to reach. The sun continued to sink. The aircraft continued to climb. 12 minutes remained. The explosion came without warning, so sudden and violent that most of the 230 people on board never had the chance to register fear. At 8:31 p.m., 12 minutes after takeoff, the warm summer sky off Long Island was split open by a flash so bright that pilots miles away instinctively turned their heads. What began as a normal, graceful climb of a 747 toward cruising altitude became, in an instant, one of the most horrifying airborne disasters ever witnessed in modern American history. High above the Atlantic, the cockpit of TWA 800 had been calm. The crew had just acknowledged a routine instruction from air traffic control. There was no distress call, no sign of trouble, no indication that anything inside the aircraft was failing. But then, in the time it takes to blink, everything changed. A blast erupted beneath the fuselage, a violent shock that tore open the belly of the jumbo jet. The cockpit voice recorder, capturing the final sounds of the crew, cut off abruptly mid-sentence. No alarms, no warnings, just a sudden end. Far below, eyewitnesses along Long Island's beaches and coastal towns saw the sky ignite. Many described a fireball, a streak of light shooting upward, or a sudden, expanding cloud of flame. Some thought it was a missile. Others believed they were witnessing a mid-air collision. To people enjoying the calm summer evening along the shoreline, the sight was so unreal that many hesitated to trust their own eyes. A few even recorded it in shocked whispers as they dialed emergency numbers, trying to explain what they had just seen. In the air nearby, pilots watched in disbelief. David McLean, flying an East Wind Airlines 737, saw the burst of light where the 747 should have been. To him, it looked like an explosion from inside the aircraft, a massive eruption of flame that broke the plane apart mid-climb. He immediately contacted air traffic control. His words, captured on tape, were calm but shaken. "We just saw an explosion out here. Something just went down into the water." Within seconds, TWA Flight 800 disappeared from radar screens. Air traffic controllers tried repeatedly to reach the crew. their voices becoming more urgent with each unanswered call. The silence was unmistakable. Something catastrophic had happened. Below the falling debris, a National Guard helicopter was conducting a routine training mission. The crew suddenly found themselves beneath a sky raining fire. Burning fragments of metal, some still glowing, fell dangerously close to the spinning rotors. The pilots later described the sight as a curtain of fire descending in front of them, like molten rain. They banked hard, narrowly avoiding the falling wreckage. Once clear of danger, they turned toward the water to begin the search for survivors. On the darkening surface of the Atlantic, flaming patches of jet fuel burned like floating campfires. Wreckage spread across miles of ocean, shards of aluminum, clothing, seats, insulation, and unrecognizable fragments that only hours earlier had made up a perfectly functional airplane. The sea carried a bitter, chemical smell of burned fuel. Smoke drifted into the cooling evening air as rescue crews raced toward the growing debris field. At the Coast Guard station in East Mauritius, alarms went off. Helicopters and boats were dispatched immediately. For the next several hours, the quiet coastal town was thrust into the center of a desperate search. Thousands of pieces of debris floated across a massive radius, and rescuers plunged into the water with the urgent hope of finding someone, anyone, still alive. But hope faded quickly. The force and violence of the explosion had been overwhelming. As Coast Guard cutters illuminated the ocean with powerful searchlights, the truth became painfully clear. Not a single life raft, not a single flare, not a single survivor appeared in the water. Wreckage floated everywhere, but no movement, no shouts, no signals of life. Families across the country began receiving the first horrifying news alerts. Televisions showed burning debris scattered across the Atlantic, and the initial reports were confusing, chaotic, contradictory. Some speculated a bomb, others feared a missile attack. Many simply prayed that the reports were wrong. In Georgia, Michelle and Becky's parents stared at the screen, searching desperately for any sign of hope. Maybe the girls had taken the later flight. Maybe there had been a mistake in the passenger list. But one phone call ended all doubt. The girls had boarded TWA 800 as scheduled. In Maryland, Jamie Hurd's family had the same desperate hope. Perhaps he had missed the flight, perhaps he had changed plans. But Jamie had been aboard, and by dawn, the families were left only with grief and confirmation of the inevitable. As the night deepened, the scale of the tragedy grew clearer. Coast Guard crews recovered bodies with solemn precision. Helicopters hovered above the black water, their spotlights sweeping back and forth. Search boats navigated through twisted metal and burning patches of fuel that glowed eerily in the darkness. Rescue divers, pushing through exhaustion, surfaced again and again with grim expressions. Hours passed. The official declaration came just before midnight. There were no survivors. In those early hours, the ocean floor became the resting place of an enormous aircraft and the remains of 230 souls whose lives had ended in a moment no one yet understood. The debris field stretched for miles, a silent map of destruction that investigators would later spend years studying, piece by piece. But that night, there was only shock. Shock on the boats. Shock in the air traffic control center. Shock in the homes of hundreds of families suddenly thrown into darkness. And across the country, millions of viewers stared at their televisions, witnessing a modern jetliner reduced to fire and fragments in less than 2 seconds. Before sunrise, a single question echoed across America. What could possibly bring down a Boeing 747 in the clear, calm sky of a July evening? Whispers of terrorism began almost immediately, long before investigators reached the crash site, and long before the first pieces of wreckage were pulled from the Atlantic. In 1996, America lived under the shadow of a growing global threat. The first World Trade Center attack had shaken national confidence, and the man behind it, Ramzi Youssef, was standing trial in New York that very week for plotting to blow up multiple U.S. airliners. To many, the timing felt too precise, too coincidental. Within hours of the disaster, the question spread across newsrooms, government agencies, and living rooms nationwide. Was TWA Flight 800 the latest act of terror? The FBI arrived among the rescue crews before daylight. Their assistant director in New York, James Kallstrom, was a seasoned investigator, a man who had seen horrific things in his career. Yet even he would later admit that as soon as he heard the first reports, his immediate instinct pointed toward foul play. The explosion seemed too violent, too sudden, too complete. He believed, at least at first, that someone had done this on purpose. Eyewitness accounts began flooding in. More than 200 people reported seeing something in the sky just before the 747 erupted. Some said it resembled a streak of light rising from the horizon. Others swore they saw an object moving upward before the plane exploded. A few claimed it looked like a missile. These accounts varied widely, but they all shared a disturbing theme. Something appeared to ascend toward the jet moments before destruction. News networks seized on these descriptions, creating a storm of speculation. Graphics of possible missile trajectories, guesses more than facts, began appearing on television. In a country still wrestling with new fears of foreign terror, the idea of a missile strike felt horrifyingly believable. Then came the photographs. Two images taken by people on Long Island seemed to show strange streaks or shapes near the sky where the plane exploded. One showed what looked like a luminous trail pointing toward the fireball. Another appeared to capture a dark cylindrical object. Though grainy and taken from far away, these images spread through newspapers, talk shows, and, most influential of all, the early internet. Suddenly, the public was convinced TWA 800 had been shot down. This belief only strengthened as reports emerged about U.S. Navy activity in the region. There had been submarines, surface ships, and a P-3 Orion aircraft conducting exercises within a few hundred miles of the crash. To the average observer, it didn't matter that they were far outside missile range. The presence of military equipment in the area was enough to fuel doubts. Rumors began to swirl. Had the Navy misfired during training? Was TWA 800 accidentally targeted? Was there a cover-up already underway? The situation escalated when Pierre Salinger, former press secretary to President John F. Kennedy, stepped before cameras and announced that he had seen proof, a radar tape, he claimed, that a Navy missile had indeed brought down the aircraft. His reputation, built over decades in journalism and politics, added enormous weight to the allegation. Many Americans believed him without hesitation. Kallstrom, leading the FBI effort, faced a difficult reality. He had to investigate every accusation, every conspiracy, every scrap of supposed evidence, no matter how unlikely. That meant following leads across hundreds of square miles of ocean and land. Agents boarded Navy ships, inspected missile inventories, studied submarine logs, questioned crews, checked for missing ordnance, and scoured radar data from civilian and military sources alike. It was a monumental effort, and the results were consistent. Nothing pointed to a missile. Every missile on every vessel and submarine was accounted for. Navy logs aligned perfectly with radar timelines. The ships were too far south. The radar tape Salinger had shared was debunked as a simple artifact known as ghosting, a mirrored reflection of another aircraft on the radar screen. But public distrust was growing. Even as investigators disproved one theory after another, the narrative of a cover-up persisted. Talk radio hosts, early online forums, and even some former military personnel claimed that something was being hidden. The combination of eyewitness confusion, emotional upheaval, and the emerging culture of internet speculation created a perfect environment for conspiracy theories to flourish. Meanwhile, investigators broadened their search. If it wasn't a missile, could it have been a bomb? That question carried its own gravity. The FBI combed through passenger lists, cargo manifests, and the backgrounds of everyone who had boarded the plane. They analyzed luggage, studied the possibility of explosive devices, and even examined the plane's service history. Months later, a surprising discovery reignited the bomb theory. Chemical traces, RDX and PETN, were found on pieces of the floorboard from the aircraft. These were classic components of military-grade explosives. For a moment, it seemed everything was coming together. Traces of explosives, eyewitness reports of streaks in the sky, a sudden mid-air breakup. Yet once again, deeper investigation revealed the truth to be far more mundane. TWA had lent the very same aircraft to law enforcement officers in St. Louis a month before the crash. They had used it for K-9 explosive detection training, and one of the training aids had cracked, leaking small amounts of explosive residue. The chemicals were real, but unrelated to the crash. Piece by piece, the dramatic theories began to fall apart. No bomb, no missile, no terrorist, no mistaken military strike. The FBI, after consuming millions of dollars, tens of thousands of hours, and endless public scrutiny, had reached a conclusion many found unsatisfying. There was no evidence that anyone had deliberately destroyed TWA Flight 800. But this only deepened the central mystery. If it wasn't terrorism or military error, if no external force had torn the plane apart, then what had? That question now passed from the FBI to the one organization built to answer it, the National Transportation Safety Board. And their investigation would lead to a discovery far more unsettling than the theories left behind. Before the investigation could uncover answers, it first had to recover 1 million scattered pieces of a fallen giant. At dawn, the morning after the crash, Navy divers descended into the cold, debris-strewn waters off Long Island. What they found on the ocean floor was a field of destruction so vast and fragmented that even seasoned recovery teams were stunned. Twisted aluminum, torn wiring, luggage, shattered panels, seats, insulation, and fragments no larger than a hand formed a silent, sprawling graveyard. Every piece mattered. Every piece could tell a story. The National Transportation Safety Board, the agency responsible for determining the cause of aviation accidents, knew the task ahead would be unlike anything in its history. This was not a simple structural failure, nor a collision, nor a routine explosion. The plane had broken apart violently, and investigators needed to reconstruct it, literally. The Navy recovered the wreckage, but the NTSB had to interpret it. The pieces were collected, cataloged, rinsed, and transported to a vast hangar in Calverton, New York. Under glaring lights, technicians laid out every fragment on a marked grid, slowly building a three-dimensional puzzle of the aircraft's center section. It took months of painstaking work, but eventually, the skeletal outline of the 747's fuselage rose from the hangar floor, an enormous ghost-like sculpture made of scorched metal and silence. When metallurgist Jim Wilday, one of the most experienced investigators on the team, examined the front portion of the center wing section, he noticed something disturbing: a series of dents and crush patterns on the massive front spar of the center wing fuel tank. These dents pushed inward, not outward, an unusual pattern. They didn't match any external impact. Instead, they pointed to something originating inside the tank. That observation changed the course of the investigation. But before committing to that theory, investigators had to rule out the more dramatic explanations. The FBI had found no bomb, no explosive residue beyond the unrelated K-9 training contamination, No shrapnel signature, no explosive pitting, no evidence whatsoever of an external strike. All forensic paths pointed away from sabotage. So Wildy turned back to what the crash debris did reveal. Fractures radiating outward from the area around the center wing tank were consistent with an internal overpressure event, an explosion. But what could possibly ignite a nearly empty jet fuel tank? Contrary to instinct, investigators knew that jet fuel vapor is far more dangerous than the liquid itself. A nearly empty fuel tank on a hot day can become an enormous invisible bomb if the vapors reach flash point. And on July 17th, JFK had baked under a summer heat wave. More importantly, the plane had sat on the tarmac with its air conditioning packs running directly beneath the center tank for nearly an hour during the boarding delay. These air packs, which pull extremely hot compressed air from the engines, generate significant heat. And on this particular aircraft, they had been operating at full strength. Investigators ran calculations. The flash point of the Jet A vapor that day was around 36.6 degrees. They suspected the fuel might have reached or exceeded that threshold, but they needed proof. So the FAA and NTSB conducted an unprecedented test. They parked a Boeing 747 on a hot runway, filled its center wing tank with the same amount of fuel TWA 800 had, barely 190 liters, and activated the air conditioning packs. Then they flew it with temperature sensors installed throughout the tank. The results shocked everyone. The fuel vapor inside the tank reached 53 degrees, far above flash point. The tank had transformed into an enormous container of explosive vapor. That answered only half the mystery. For an explosion to occur, the tank also needed an ignition source. Jet fuel tanks are designed specifically to prevent sparks. Wiring inside the tank carries only milliamps of low voltage, far too little to ignite vapor. So what could have sparked? Investigator Bob Swaim followed the trail of wiring from the cockpit to the top of the center wing tank. There, he discovered something troubling. A terminal block with sharp metal edges that could chafe wiring insulation. If the insulation had been compromised, a wire inside the tank could become exposed. But that still didn't explain how enough voltage could enter the tank to ignite vapor. The answer lay outside the tank. Running alongside the fuel probe wires were bundles of high-voltage wires powering cabin lighting and other systems. On a 25-year-old aircraft with years of vibration, maintenance, and environmental wear, the insulation on these bundles could degrade. If a high-voltage surge jumped from one of those wires into the fuel quantity indication system wires, it could travel down into the tank. And if the tank wiring had exposed sections, a spark was possible. When investigators examined wiring from TWA 800 and other aging 747s, they found more than they expected: chafed insulation, taped repairs, metal shavings, fluid contamination, cracking, discoloration. The aging fleet showed widespread signs of electrical vulnerability that the industry had underestimated. Still, this was only a theory until investigators listened again to the cockpit voice recorder. At the very end of the recording, just milliseconds before the tape went silent, they detected something almost invisible: 2 microsecond-long power interruptions. Such interruptions are a classic signature of a short circuit. It was the missing piece. A short circuit had occurred. Somewhere in the aircraft's electrical system, voltage had jumped, likely into the fuel tank wiring. Finally, with wreckage analysis, metallurgical data, fuel vapor temperatures, electrical behavior, witness observations, and recorder evidence aligned, investigators could reconstruct the exact sequence that doomed the flight. And it was far more unsettling than terrorism or a missile. It was the kind of failure that could happen silently, invisibly, on any aging aircraft. The cause was not a bomb, not a missile, not sabotage, not a foreign plot. It was heat, vapor, aging wires, and a spark no one ever saw. The final moments of TWA Flight 800 began long before the passengers fastened their seatbelts, long before the aircraft pushed back from the gate. By the time the 747 lifted from runway 22R that warm July evening, everything needed for catastrophe was already in place. Overheated vapor inside the center wing tank, aging wires hidden deep beneath the cabin floor, and one electrical spark that would act as the invisible trigger. But to understand the full tragedy of that night and the legacy it would leave, we must walk through the events exactly as they unfolded, second by second. At 8:29 p.m., Flight 800 climbed steadily through 13,000 feet. The air was smooth, the sky clear, and the crew exchanged routine instructions with air traffic control. The passengers were settling into the early stages of a long transatlantic journey. In first class, Becky Olson and Michelle Becker likely watched the lights of Long Island fade behind them, unaware that beneath their feet, the center wing tank was filled not with liquid fuel, but with a hot, volatile vapor-air mixture primed for ignition. As the aircraft reached approximately 14,000 feet, electricity coursed through a network of wires that had seen 2.5 decades of vibration, repairs, and environmental stress. Somewhere in the belly of the aircraft, likely near a bundle where high-voltage lighting wires ran alongside the low-voltage fuel quantity indication system, insulation had worn thin. When a surge of current leapt across that gap, it rode down the fuel probe wiring straight into the tank. There, where a section of insulation had been abraded, the jump finally found metal. A spark flashed in complete darkness. Inside the tank, the temperature was well above the flash point. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then everything did. The vapor ignited in an instantaneous, devastating fireball that tore outward with the force of a shaped blast. The inner structure of the tank shattered. Span-wise beams buckled and slammed into the front spar. The aluminum skin ruptured. Shock waves punched upward through the fuselage. In the cockpit, no alarm sounded. The crew had no warning, no chance to react. The cockpit voice recorder cut off mid-sentence, its power lost in an instant. The blast ripped through the underside of the fuselage, splitting it open like a seam. Structural failure propagated along stress lines at lightning speed. Investigators later calculated that within just a few seconds, the entire nose section, cockpit, forward cabin, and front cargo areas separated cleanly from the rest of the aircraft. The forward portion entered a steep downward fall, plunging toward the Atlantic like a bullet. The rest of the plane, still carrying the majority of the passengers, continued briefly upward, propelled by its own momentum. This upward movement is what eyewitnesses later described as a streak of light shooting into the sky. Many believed it was a missile, but in reality, it was the main fuselage of the 747, wounded and burning, rising briefly before aerodynamics stole the last of its lift. It then rolled, stalled, and began its final descent, an uncontrolled, tumbling fall marked by a trail of flame, sparks, and debris. Inside what remained of the aircraft, the passengers were almost certainly unconscious. The violent rupture and sudden loss of pressurization would have overwhelmed them instantly. The cabin was filled with smoke, fire, and freezing air. The aircraft broke apart further as it fell, scattering fragments over miles of ocean. At 8:31 p.m., the final sections of TWA Flight 800 hit the Atlantic. The impact forces were unsurvivable. The water, though calm, offered no mercy. In just 12 minutes, a routine flight had transformed into a catastrophe that defied imagination. 230 lives had ended in the span of seconds. By dawn, the ocean told a bleak story. Coast Guard boats moved slowly through drifting debris, suitcases, torn clothing, pages from books, children's toys, fragments of insulation, and twisted metal. Divers recovered bodies with steady, solemn care. Some were discovered near pieces of the cabin floor, others near sections of fuselage, and many in currents that had already begun carrying them away from the primary impact zone. Families gathered at airports across the world, numb with disbelief. At JFK, TWA agents escorted grieving parents and spouses into private rooms. In Georgia, the families of Becky and Michelle clung to the impossible hope that their daughters had switched flights. When confirmation came, the silence in their homes was heavier than any scream. In Maryland, the Hurd family prepared for the unbearable journey of bringing Jamie home. Across the United States and abroad, hundreds of families entered the darkest nights of their lives. Over the following months, as divers continued their work, the remains of all 230 people were eventually recovered, an extraordinary and heartbreaking achievement. Many were identified only through DNA analysis. Each recovery carried weight, each identification a moment of closure mixed with pain. When the NTSB finally presented the official cause of the crash, an explosion in the center wing tank triggered by a short circuit, it was an answer met with both relief and discomfort. Relief that there was no hidden enemy, no missile, no conspiracy. Discomfort because the cause was so ordinary, so preventable, so embedded in the everyday operations of aging aircraft. This was not a tragedy born of malice. It was born of heat, vapor, design limitations, and an industry slow to recognize the dangers of aging electrical systems. The realization led to sweeping changes. The Federal Aviation Administration issued more than 70 airworthiness directives, rewriting maintenance standards for wiring, mandating inspections, and requiring modifications that reduce the risk of ignition in fuel tanks. Boeing redesigned systems, introduced better insulation, and, most importantly, began implementing fuel tank inerting systems. By replacing oxygen-rich air in tanks with nitrogen-enriched air, the possibility of ignition could be virtually eliminated. These systems became mandatory in new aircraft. Slowly, gradually, the skies became safer. The kind of explosion that destroyed TWA Flight 800 became dramatically less likely. On Long Island, at Smith Point County Park, the families of the victims worked together to create a memorial overlooking the ocean, the last place their loved ones were seen alive. The monument's centerpiece is a curved black granite wall inscribed with every name. Behind it rises a sculpture pointed toward the open sea. In the quiet of early morning, when mist drifts over the sand and gulls call softly above the waves, the memorial feels like a bridge between worlds, the living and the lost. For parents like Walter and Orly Becker, who lost their daughter Michelle, the memorial is both a wound and a sanctuary. For Jim Hurd, it is the closest place he can be to his son Jamie's final resting place. And for countless others whose lives were touched by the tragedy, it stands as a reminder of the fragility of life, the responsibility of engineering, and the enduring ache of memory. The legacy of TWA Flight 800 is carved not only in marble and steel, but in every safety regulation, every redesigned fuel tank, every modern aircraft protected from the dangers lurking in heat and vapor. The tragedy reshaped aviation, forcing the world to confront flaws hidden deep in its most trusted machines. And so, nearly 3 decades later, each time a jet lifts from the runway into the evening sky, it does so under the silent protection of lessons written in fire, wreckage, and 230 irreplaceable lives that were lost in those final seconds from disaster.